Hi, I'm Ralph Preston, and I'm with William Lowe. We're back for another roadmap. Back in January, we put out a survey in our groups on Facebook, and we got a lot of feedback from you, everybody, and we appreciate that. We discovered that there were some of the topics that we'd already talked about, and then since January, we've talked about a number of others. And this is one from that list that we hadn't gotten to yet, and it's on long-term planning and goals. So um, William takes a structured approach to this, so he's going to start us off and tell us a little bit about that.
Right, thanks, Ralph. Yeah, so when I talk about taking on a structured approach, what I mean by this is doing things doing things every single day in your recovery after stroke, which are done with intention towards what you ultimately want to achieve in your recovery after stroke. So, for example, if your goal in your recovery after stroke is to learn how to return to walking without the cane, what this would mean is that every single day you would have a to-do list of certain exercises, whether this be squats, bridges, or bridges, or any other balance exercises which you have to go through in order for you to make incremental improvements, which would ultimately lead you towards your goal of, being able to return to walking or being able to improve your walking gait. Um, and I believe that taking on a structured approach in the long term in your recovery after stroke, it can be really beneficial because you know that by doing these things every single day, that eventually you are going to reach your goal. And if you do find that you're in a situation where maybe you're not seeing as many improvements as you typically would, or maybe you feel like your recovery has come to a plateau or standstill, it might be because you've stopped doing these exercises, or it could be because of some other thing, like maybe this structured approach needs to be changed in some way, or say or some form in the exercise you're doing in order for you to get a different outcome in the long run. So I know, Ralph, you have a very similar approach in your recovery after stroke. You took on a similar approach in your recovery after stroke when you first had your stroke. I was just wondering if you could share a little bit about that and how you went about it.
Sure. Um, well, I I got out of the rehab hospital about a little after lunch, and it was an hour and a half from home. So by the time I got out of there and got home and everything, it was mid to late afternoon. So I didn't do anything that day, but I literally started walking. I started. I knew I was going to get into PT. They told me that PT would call. It'd probably take a week or two. I didn't want to wait. And I also had a friend who had come down because my wife was not available. She was teaching and had exams that week. So I had a friend around. I wanted to take advantage of him. Not take advantage of him, take advantage of the fact that he was there willing to help me. So I immediately came up with a plan to walk every day and also to work on my arm and shoulder and my hand. And I wouldn't say I refined it, the day I got home from the hospital. I probably launched into it and refined it over the next week or two. So, yeah, I walked every day. As I got a little better, I also worked on, I set goals within the goals. Obviously, the big goal would be to return to walking as much as normal, as close to normal as possible. But I also did things like said, okay, my knee's still hyperextending, so we don't want that, and my ankle's not moving as well as I'd like to see it. So in addition to walking, the actual walking, my underneath my bigger goal of walking, I set smaller goals or schedules or structure to where I would work on my knee, work on my ankle, work on my hip every day, and also um, engage in active walking because that's where you put all the pieces together, and that's ultimately what you want to do. So, I didn't know anything about it. I didn't. I lucked into the whole thing with my friend coming down, and the fact that I didn't want to wait for PT and everything. And I basically set up a home program, and I started it on pretty much day one because, like I said, I didn't get home till 4 o'clock in the afternoon. So that was kind of my structured approach to it. Um, why don't we talk a little bit about PT, since I mentioned, it took a couple weeks. Typically here in the States, it takes a couple of weeks before they refer you. Sometimes you can call and speed up the process. Sometimes they don't have the order yet. Sometimes they actually have the order, but they haven't called you. So that's when calling them might be a good idea. I'm a big believer in that good physical and occupational therapists talk to you about what your goals are, because it's you they're trying to make better. When they don't talk to you, might have to worry that they're taking the playbook and applying whatever generic things to that may not address your specific goals. If we back up a little bit, when I was in the rehab hospital, I guess I was in neuro at the hospital about 5 days, and they transferred me over. The second day I was there, I asked my wife to bring my camera in, and I took my camera to OT on day 3, and I showed him like how you focused and the various motions that I had to do to operate the DSLR camera with both hands, and because that was one of the goals that I set for myself and with them, and they showed me, and so I started working on those exercises. Although they were very, very primitive at that point because I'd only gotten one little flicker of movement, and I was just starting to build on it. I mean, we're talking 1/8 of an inch of movement, but before you can do the exercises they tell you to do to focus, you got to get some movement. So I was working in that direction. So, William, why don't you tell us a little bit about your thoughts in terms of the relationship that you should have with your PT and OT?
Yeah, sure. So I've spoken to and I've exchanged notes with a lot of stroke survivors since I first started my recovery after stroke. And one of the things which I've heard from some stroke survivors is that they treat going to their OT and PT like exercise. And I'm here to tell you that if you take on this approach, it's very likely that you might not be making the most out of your recovery, because ultimately, as Ralph said, the OT and PT are there to help you. And in my own recovery after stroke, I found that by really taking on a collaborative approach with my OTs and my PTs, that I was able to make the most out of my recovery. So basically what I did in my journey is that I took the opportunity to treat every session like a consultation, and I would come prepared to every session with the OT and the PT with questions to ask, and I would ask them to explain to me and just provide me with the understanding which I needed to know in order to really drive my recovery forward. And I find that this is really important in recovery after stroke, because the reason why everyone's looking for that magic fix is because sometimes therapists, sometimes clinicians, or sometimes OTs and PTs, they don't take the time to explain the why behind why they're suggesting a sort of exercise for you to do when you go home. And without that why, then you essentially don't know how to actually make recovery happen for yourself. So one thing I realized early on is that if I want to get this handled, and if I want to know how to drive my recovery when I'm not here with the OT and the PT, then I've got to understand how they're thinking, so that I can go home and I can think like they do when I do my exercises. And so when I run out of OT and PT, then I have everything I need to know in my brain, because I've learned from the OT and the PT, to know what I need to do in recovery and what I need to avoid in order to make the most out of my recovery. So I think that that's a really effective approach when it comes to forming your relationship with your OT and PT, because like Ralph said, they're ultimately there to help you. And if you're not going to prompt them to provide the reasoning behind why they're suggesting certain exercises, then they're just going to continue. Then it's very likely that they're going to continue doing things by the book or by the textbook and allow you to do exercises which will get you to a point in recovery where you're just getting by, rather than being able to make the most out of recovery after stroke and continue to see those improvements which every stroke survivor is looking for. So this is where I just want to take a moment to talk about the two approaches which I've seen in the medical system. This is, now I live in Australia, but I would imagine that this might occur in the United States as well. But you can either take on a prescription approach when it comes to therapy, where you're going to your therapist and they're treating you as if they would treat you like a doctor, and they're just giving you a magic pill to go home and do and take without actually explaining what you need to do and why you have to do things. In other words, you're basically just going to them when you're not learning anything about how to drive your recovery. Or you can take the opportunity to take on a collaborative approach with your therapist, and you can go to your OT and your PT, and you can sit down and you can have a discussion about your goals and how the exercises you're doing are relevant to what you want to achieve in your recovery after stroke, and why it is that you actually need to do the exercises which they're suggesting in order to help you reach your goals. And quite often what I found is that the therapists and the OTs and the PTs who are able to explain to you why certain exercises are relevant in order for you to achieve your goal of being able to return to walking or being able to get back more functional use of the hand, they are the clinicians, or they are the therapists who really know how to help you in your recovery after stroke. Because more often than not, if you find a therapist who doesn't know how to explain things in such a way that you're able to understand why you have to do something in order to achieve your goal, then it's very likely that you're just being given exercises from the textbook, which are ultimately just going to get you to a point where you're just getting by in your recovery after stroke. So Ralph, earlier we were talking about how we both approached OTs and PTs, and you also shared a similar approach, I believe, but obviously using different words. So I was just wondering, would you like to shed some light on how you approach your OT and your PT?
Sure. I looked at him like a teacher. Like I use the analogy of a piano teacher. Piano teacher, either go to the piano teacher once a week or they come to your house and they instruct you on what you to do during the week, and you practice. And if you don't practice, then you don't get better, and your piano teacher knows it. And it's true of any. It could be anything: golf lessons, trumpet, any analogy you want. I'm the type of person that I told every PT and OT within the first 5 or 10 minutes of my initial consult or visit that I needed to have everything explained to me, because I'm just that type of person. It's also beneficial in the sense that since I started this home program, not wanting to wait for PT because I had my friend there to walk me, I built on that. And when you understand like why you're doing something, then it helps you with your long-term plan. Because ultimately, like you said, when you run out of insurance and you can't go to the PT and OT, you're going to be on your own. And the more you know, the closer, in 20 visits or something, you're not going to become an OT or a PT, but you can learn a whole lot more by asking questions than you can by sitting there and taking the book approach. I once said that I thought I've taken people to physical therapy and gone back with them. Here, typically, William, in the States, they take the more active approach. They work with you as opposed to the prescription approach. Of course, there's often a lot of business to take care of with the hospital system or whatever. So in 45 minutes, you're lucky to get in a good 30 minutes of PT or OT. Anyway, so I have always, tried to learn everything I can from, and I told them within shortly that I needed to understand everything, and I would probably ask a lot of questions. And I tried not to run the whole session, but I typically brought in a couple questions, and I didn't finish what I was saying there. I've taken a couple of people, and one of them never said a word. Went to like 100 sessions. He basically never said a word. He said a couple things, but didn't interact. And it took somebody else who wanted to be friends with the therapist. So that's fine. I did a little, a minute or two of chit chat in the beginning, but basically I was there to learn. And so I think that a good relationship with your PT, OT, you're both talking, maybe 50-50. So that's was my approach to therapists in my own recovery, and one that I've suggested to a number of people that I've worked with and taken to physical therapy. Not all of them follow it, but all you can do is offer ideas to people and let them choose whether or not they want to adopt them or not. So those are my thoughts on PT. One thing I think that's important here is kind of an overarching thing, and that's that you try and do whatever you can do and plan on having. I know it's not you can't exactly plan on it, but a good attitude goes a long way, and so does positive affirmations and believing in yourself. So part of my plan would be, would be, plan on, part of your plan might include planning on getting better, and visualize yourself getting better and tell yourself you're going to get better and watch yourself get better, which brings us to the next topic, William. We both believe in measuring and quantifying progress. So, there are a number of ways you can do this. William, why don't you start us off, because you did video and I didn't, even though I'm a video guy, and then I'll fill in any blanks, anything else I can think of about other ways of doing it or how I did it.
Yeah, sure thing. So I'm happy to talk about ways to really know whether or not you're making improvements in your recovery to stay motivated in the long term. But first, I just want to highlight and emphasize what Ralph said about making sure that you do have that discussion with your therapist, because if you're not talking to your therapist, then you're likely going to get into a situation where they give you an exercise to do and they just end up watching you for half of the session do the exact same exercise without actually providing any contribution or any value or anything else for you to do, or explaining why it is that you have to do that exercise you're doing. But anyway, what I want to talk about is ways of really keeping track of your progress as you go about in your recovery after stroke, because as all of you folks who might know who are watching this right now, stroke recovery is not easy, and it can be extremely difficult to remain motivated and remain and I guess persevere as the years go by, especially when you get into those stages of recovery where maybe you're noticing that you're not seeing improvements as much as you used to, or maybe if you're in a situation where you've just been where you've just finished up with therapy and your therapist have just told you that this is as good as it's going to get. So one of the things which I discovered in my journey early on in my own recovery is that there needed to be some way that I could learn about recovery after stroke from my therapist. And also, there also needed to be a way which I could assess whether or not I was making improvements. So, one of the methods which I developed early on, and I had an iPad when I was in hospital, was to actually take video of myself walking every single week or every single day and use this video as a way of identifying whether or not I was making improvements in my recovery. And this is really powerful because as a stroke survivor myself, living through this every single day, I don't see improvements versus being able to see, versus being able to look back in hindsight, maybe a month or two later. So I think that video is a really powerful way to really identify whether or not you're making improvements in your recovery. Because with video, you can take film of yourself before you start a therapy, and then once you finish therapy, you can compare the film that you've got at the end of therapy versus the one from the start and see what the differences are between those. Now, another thing about video, another thing about taking video is that you can actually use the video of yourself, which you're filming, whether this be at the clinic with your therapist or at home doing the exercises, and you can take that video to your therapist and you can again have that discussion, like Ralph said, with your therapist, and you can ask your therapist, you can probe them, you can ask them questions about how you're doing the exercises at home and what you could do better in order for you to get to that next level in your recovery after stroke. Quite often, I find that taking video, especially for walking, is really important because when you have video of yourself walking and you give it to your therapist or you show it to your PT, they can point it out to you whether or not you've got hip dip or whether or not you're leaning too much on your not affected side when you're walking and you're compensating too much. And they can use the video which you provided them as a way of letting you know why they are suggesting the exercises which they've suggested to you and how they're relevant to your goal of being able to improve your walking or return to walking, and why it is important for you to walk every single day in order to apply everything which you've been doing at home with the exercises they've suggested. And I also think that taking video can be really good for yourself in the future as well, because quite often we don't give ourselves enough credit for how much we've achieved. And if you take video of yourself before therapy and you look at it after you finish, 13 weeks of therapy, whether this be through your own home exercise program which you've designed or through your OT and your PT, then you can really see whether or not changes have happened. And I would imagine that you could use this as evidence to show the insurance company that you are actually improving and that improvements are possible, contrary to what your therapist has said. So I think that taking video and really keeping track of progress in your recovery after stroke is really important, especially when it comes to remaining motivated and especially setting those big long-term goals which you're really aspiring towards. Now, I know, Ralph, you had some ideas on how you kept notes of your own progress in your recovery after stroke. I was just wondering if you wanted to highlight some of those versus what I mentioned about video.
Sure. Well, first off, I don't have any video from, probably first 9 or 10 years. I didn't start making any videos of myself till I started making exercise recovery videos to help other people. And I really wish I did. It's ironic since I'm a video professional my whole life, but for whatever reason I didn't do that. So I used several methods. Well, some people journal. I don't journal. That's a way of writing down how you feel about your walking that day, or your arm and shoulder, or whatever you're working on. also if you journal, you can write down like how far you walked or how many laps. I walked laps around my driveway in the beginning. I didn't want to stray too far in case I had to crawl back to the house. So I just would walk to the mailbox and back over and over. So I knew how many laps I did. Same with things like bridges or squats. In the beginning, you could only do 6 squats, and I got up to 20 or 30 that I could do. So, I didn't write those numbers down. You certainly could. I keep numbers in my head. So I always knew what my number that I was working on in terms of number of laps, number of squats, number of heel raises, whatever. So I knew what I was, how far I was, and one thing that I think is, especially if you've increased the number of laps. Let's say I do 10 laps, and then the next day I do 11 laps. There's no guarantee I'm going to do 12 laps the next day. If you do 10 or 11 and maintain, that's an acceptable goal. Then you move back to, 12 the next day, or do 11 for a few days till you're able to do 12. So, because if you set unrealistic goals, you won't be able to achieve them, and I think that has a real negative effect. One of the things, somebody I was talking with in one of the groups one time, it was in about this time of year, June, July, and they said they were going to run a 5K in just November, December. Well, they were hardly walking from some videos I saw that they posted, and I suggested that they set a goal of running a 5K as soon as possible and not put a date with it, because I think that it's easy to set yourself to not be able to achieve it. And the way I sold it to them was, you could also maybe achieve it earlier, and if you got the state out there, then, maybe you'll slow yourself down. So I think the whole thing about setting a realistic goals and, what you did, repeating what you did yesterday, if you're making progress, repeating what you did yesterday is just as good, because in that curve up, one day where it goes even, then goes back up again, and going to change the big curve in the long run. So, so I guess, whatever your goal is, you set them and try and achieve them. I mean, they can be as simple as being able to pick up a glass with your affected hand. Let's do it with my affected hand, being able to tip it and drink it. There you would work on being able to open your hand. You also work on supination and pronation of your wrist, because you're going to have to tip it towards you. So, I say have a overarching plan for all the different parts you're working on: walking, hand and arm, shoulder and arm and hand. And then I had sub plans within walking. Like I mentioned earlier, I had one for my ankles, knees and hips that I'd work on in addition to doing the actual walking. Well, that could be true of, grabbing the glass and taking a drink, or being able to put the pitcher back in the refrigerator with your affected hand, or walking your daughter down the aisle, or going back to work. They can build, those are really big things as opposed to grabbing a glass. Although when you grab a glass for the first time and take a drink out of it, that's one way of measuring progress. I couldn't do that before, and now I can. That's one of the best ways to measure progress. Or I didn't spill this time. I'm still not getting into my lips very, very eloquently, but at least I didn't pour it all over me this time. So the point here, obviously, William, and you know this, is to pay attention to your recovery and mark in some way, either through video, journaling, a ledger in your mind, so that so that you can be sure you're making progress. Because if you're making progress, I believe success builds on success. I've said that probably 50 or 100 times now. But when you have small, that's why you set small goals, because if you set small goals, you're more likely to achieve them. Um, and when you achieve your goals, then it motivates you to set higher goals and get up tomorrow and keep at it because you're making progress. So that's pretty much what I've got to say on the subject. You have anything else?
Yeah, I do. And also as you're going about in your recovery, just on that theme of keeping track, it's always important to look out for those flickers of movement, which Ralph and I have talked about before. Because listen, the train to recovery is only going to stop at the train station for so long. And when you get that flicker of movement, that's your brain telling you that this is your opportunity to jump on recovery and make whatever movement you've gotten back, however small, whether this be an eighth of an inch, a lot bigger until your brain has got it down permanently. So when it comes to keeping track of your recovery through video or through journaling, it's really important to keep a stern eye on the little incremental improvements which you can see, capitalize on these and make them a lot bigger, because these little aha moments that your brain has when it's learning how to do things again in your recovery after stroke, they're likely not going to happen more than once. And it's important to jump on that opportunity in order to make sure that your brain doesn't forget how to actually learn how to do something it used to do before you actually had your stroke. So I just really want to underline and really emphasize that, because that's where video comes in handy, where you can actually see the improvements. And that's where journaling comes in handy, making sure that you're identifying whether or not you're doing more laps around your house compared to before. Because then you actually know that recovery is happening and you're actually making things happen rather than because of what you're doing, in that taking on and the approach you're taking is actually working in your favor to turn odds in your favor.
Right. Well, that's about it from both of us. I'll put the link to the flickers of movement talk that William and I had in the description below the video, like I did last week for the glutes. I put glute exercises. So one of the things I'm starting to do is put some either relevant talks or exercises in the description. So if you want to listen to that talk on flickers of movement, there'll be a clickable link right there in description. So William, thank you for your time, and we'll see you and everybody again the next time we have another roadmap talk.
Great. Thanks, Ralph.